An old man was accused, mocked, and silenced. But then someone walked into the room. And in that moment, everyone had to face the past. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. No one expected him to speak. In fact, most people in that courtroom didn't even believe he had the right to. You could see it on their faces: boredom, silent judgment, and conclusions already drawn. But when the door creaked open, the air shifted. A man entered, slow but certain, his steps not rushed, not forced, just intentional. His head remained high, eyes not fixed on the floor like most in his position, but staring straight ahead. His dark gray jacket was wrinkled with time, yet the faint outline of an old crease still clung to the fabric like memory. His shoes were scuffed but polished, a small act of defiance perhaps. The hat in his hand looked as though it had been carried not just through streets, but through decades. His name was Elijah Moore, and not a single soul in that courtroom had any idea just how much weight he'd brought in with him that morning. The charge was simple: trespassing in an abandoned public building - unlawful occupation, as the papers called it. His only crime? Sitting for one night at the entrance of a structure he had built brick by brick in his youth. On paper, it was open and shut. But in reality, things were never that simple. And this reality stretched far beyond the edges of a file folder. Judge Henry Dalton, impatient as ever, didn't even lift the case file when he said, "Another homeless case? The court won't tolerate wasted time. If there's an objection, say it now." But no one spoke. Elijah had come alone. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't filed a defense. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was his burden to carry, and he knew it. Elijah sat slowly, resting his hands atop his knees, eyes still lowered, as if waiting not just for a trial but for something else entirely. From the far corner of the room, a young reporter named Marcus Bell shifted in his seat, distracted. When he caught sight of Elijah, something stirred, a blurry memory, a photo maybe, from years back. A man in a hard hat explaining blueprints in a government building. Could it be the same man? Could time have folded that fast? Judge Dalton finally opened the file and scoffed, reading aloud with thinly veiled disdain. Elijah Moore, 82. No record, no income, no fixed address, but here to lecture us on how we've failed at our jobs. A few chuckles echoed in the room. Not loud, but deliberate, just loud enough for Elijah to hear them. Still, his gaze didn't waver. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't respond. Only once did he raise his head, and when he did, time seemed to stop. Because in his eyes, there was no anger, no begging, only something heavier. He looked like a man carrying an entire city's past on his back, returning it piece by piece. The judge sighed. "If you've got something to say, now's the time. If not, I'm giving my ruling." Elijah, completely unbothered, answered softly, "I'll speak when you're ready." The reply struck something unexpected. Judge Dalton slammed a hand onto the desk. "I'm ready, Mr. Moore. Very ready." Elijah nodded once, still seated, and began. "You've been making decisions for years, but have you ever listened? That building didn't belong to me, but its bricks still remember my hands. I didn't stay there because I had nowhere else to go. I went back because no other place feels like mine anymore." The judge narrowed his eyes. Emotion doesn't change the law. But Marcus Bell had already put his phone down. He wasn't covering a trial anymore, he was witnessing something else. This wasn't a defense. It was a message. Elijah wasn't speaking to the past. He was speaking to justice itself. Just as the judge reached for his gavel, Elijah slowly reached into the pocket of his coat. "One last request," he said. "I'd like to use my phone call." The gavel stopped midair. Judge Dalton gave a reluctant nod. A phone was handed to Elijah. He didn't hesitate. His hands didn't tremble. He dialed a number etched into muscle memory, then lifted the receiver and spoke 3 words. "Are you ready, daughter?" Exactly 20 seconds later, the courtroom doors echoed as they opened. The sharp rhythm of high heels followed. A woman stepped in dressed in black like a shadow with purpose. Her gaze cut through the room, her steps like whispers. Her name was Natalie Moore, Elijah Moore's daughter. And the court, so certain in its silence a moment before, was about to meet someone it would never forget. When Natalie Moore stepped into the room, the courtroom didn't go quiet because it already was. But the silence had changed. It wasn't from boredom or routine anymore. It was something deeper, more instinctive. As if everyone sensed that this woman wasn't just carrying something about her father, but something about all of them. No security guard stopped her. Judge Dalton's eyes widened, but his mouth remained slightly open. Natalie didn't look away from her father for even a second as she walked slowly to his side. She placed a hand on his shoulder. It didn't tremble. Elijah's eyes softened for just a moment, then steadied again. Natalie reached into her coat and pulled out a leather folder elegantly stitched, simple, precise. Without any dramatic gesture, but in a way that made sure everyone saw, she placed it on the table. Before opening it, she spoke just one sentence short, clear, sharp. I didn't bring words. I brought documents. When the folder opened, page after page of paperwork slid out. Architectural approvals, city planning stamps, deeds, even a decades-old city council resolution naming Elijah Moore as a chief architect contributing to structural development of city infrastructure. Not a single page was missing. Every document was notarized. Every seal pressed into the paper like quiet proof of the truth. Judge Dalton cleared his throat, but no sound came out. Because words, now, weren't lacking power. They were lacking substance. Natalie spoke again, without even looking up from the file. My father didn't beg you today. He didn't ask for sympathy. He just wanted to sit on the stone of a threshold he built with his own hands. That building may no longer be his, but the memory it carries still is. Just like the name you won't find in your current files, but that's still buried in the truth. Elijah Moore. Dalton looked back at the file. He had read that name dozens of times today, but this time, he saw something else. His own signature. A decade ago, at the suggestion of the city committee, he had personally sent Elijah a letter of appreciation. And now he remembered. Back then, there was a man quiet, steady working on the very projects that reshaped the city. But he had never connected him to this old man sitting before him now. In the corner, Marcus Bell's fingers still rested on his phone. But he wasn't typing anymore. He wasn't reporting. He was witnessing. Because this wasn't a reveal. It was a return. Truth had entered the room with such weight. The air itself had become too thick to breathe. Finally, the judge managed to speak. The validity of these documents. Natalie interrupted him. Gently, but with absolute clarity. They all come from within your own system. The signature's yours. The approval's yours. You just forgot. Elijah lowered his head slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his fists. He simply took a breath. Deep. Heavy. A breath held in for years. Because within that breath was the sweat of youth, the smile of a woman, the day a home was born, and the rise of a city. None of that was written in the documents. But all of it was there. Judge Dalton reached toward the gavel. But this time, he stopped before lifting it. He stared at it for a long moment. And then, when he finally spoke, the words didn't come out like a verdict. They came like surrender. The claim has been deemed valid in all respects. The case is dismissed. Initiate the process of restitution. No one clapped. No one cheered. Instead, someone exhaled. And for the first time, everyone in that courtroom could actually breathe. Justice hadn't arrived with a bang of the gavel, but with the act of remembering. Elijah stood. Slowly, he placed his old, worn hat on his head, the same one that had been crushed by years of carrying weight. Natalie didn't take his arm because Elijah could still walk, but they walked out together. As they crossed the threshold, Elijah paused, turned once more to look back at the room. One day, everyone learns to see, but those who learn to listen, they're the ones who build justice. The door closed gently behind them, and all that remained was silence. But this time, that silence meant respect. While silence ruled behind the closed courtroom door, the outside world had just begun to stir. When Natalie and Elijah stepped out of the courthouse, there was no wall of reporters waiting for them. No flashes, no microphones, no loud questions hurled their way. Because no one had expected Elijah Moore to make history that day. No one except Marcus Bell. The young journalist had leapt from his seat, following them without missing a single moment, not just with a story in hand, but with something far more meaningful, the beginning of a legacy. That evening, Marcus posted a video online under a short but powerful title that spread like a silent scream across the internet. An architect returned, and the walls of justice cracked. At first, the comments were slow. Then they picked up. Then they exploded. I grew up in a building this man helped build. I remember him, he worked with my father. I haven't heard this name in years, but I never forgot it. And one person left just a single sentence. Justice goes quiet in some places. But sometimes Someone comes back and reminds us. That digital echo marked the first step in the quiet war Natalie had been preparing. She hadn't grown up outside the system, on the contrary. She had risen within it. She had worked on urban renewal projects, overseeing the digitization of property records, and when she was eventually appointed to the city's largest initiative, the Reconstruction Board, she noticed something. Missing names. Names pushed to the margins of files, never acknowledged, listed not as architects, but as site assistants, even though they had carried the backbone of the design. Her father was one of them, and for years, Natalie searched for his name in those files but never found it. Until one day, buried deep in a non-digital folder, she uncovered a faded photocopy, Elijah Moore's signature, and above it, scribbled in his own handwriting, "Let the facade stones catch the sunlight. Let people see hope as they pass." That sentence was Natalie's declaration of war. From that moment on, she was no longer just a project manager. She became an engineer determined to load her father's memory onto the very system that had erased him. And that engineering had already overturned a courtroom verdict. In the days following the trial, whispers began to ripple through the city. Old laborers, long-retired municipal workers, and the ghosts of demolished buildings all began to resurface. The documents Natalie had released triggered a silent chain reaction. No one shouted, but everyone was writing, sharing, remembering. And that day, Elijah Moore made no statements. Neither did Natalie. They didn't stand in front of cameras because this fight wasn't meant to make headlines. It was meant to awaken memory. And memories, they don't just return with time. Sometimes, they return through silence. But the system had begun to feel the tremors. The next day, an official notice arrived at Natalie's office. Overstepping professional boundaries, unauthorized use of classified documents, interference with judicial process. It was a warning, a veiled threat. Natalie closed the folder, picked up the notice, and placed it in a wooden chest. Meanwhile, Elijah sat out on the porch in his old chair, legs stretched out, eyes closed, a look of peace across his face. "What's happening in there?" he asked, without opening his eyes. Natalie smiled. "The walls have started to speak, Dad." Elijah nodded. "Then let them listen well." On the second morning, for the first time, the courthouse walls began to tremble, not from inside, but from out. The press, social media, and the public, each was stepping closer to the truth. The documents Natalie had presented didn't just prove Elijah's innocence, they pulled back the curtain on a long-standing pattern of systemic neglect. And the more this was noticed, the louder the response became. But the real panic wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. That morning, as Judge Henry Dalton sipped his coffee, he found an unexpected file on his desk. Inside were archive logs, email threads, and internal reports Natalie Moore had accessed over the past 2 years. There was only one sentence written across the top in red ink: abuse of authority. Dalton closed the folder. He understood exactly what it meant. This was a warning. Sometimes the gears of the system grind down justice. Other times, they crush the smaller cogs to protect their own fear. Natalie Moore's rise had become too visible, and Elijah Moore's quiet defiance no longer looked like dignity. It looked like a threat, because the silence of an old man can make enough noise to shake certain chairs loose. That same day, Natalie received a formal notice of investigation. The reason? Unauthorized access to public records. Archiving documents related to her own approved projects was now being treated as a criminal act. When Natalie packed up her files and left the office, some eyes dropped to the floor. No one dared confront her directly, but everyone knew her presence now registered as danger. But Natalie wasn't alone. That evening, while Elijah sat on the porch, an old pickup truck pulled up. A broad-shouldered man with gray hair stepped out, holding a box that looked less like paperwork and more like time itself. When Natalie came to the door, her eyes widened. She didn't recognize the man, but Elijah squinted and smiled. "This is Charlie," he said, a former sworn engineer, the last man still holding the 1983 project files. When Charlie opened the box, inside were yellowed, curled-edged plans drawn in careful handwriting. At the bottom was Elijah Moore's youthful signature and a note. Community Center Support Columns. Alternate Structural Support Model. E. Moore, Lead Designer. That building still stood. It still belonged to the city. But nowhere in the official records was Elijah's name. These plans had never been submitted to the system. Because back then, signatures from black engineers were often reclassified under support staff in government records. Charlie let out a long sigh. We all stayed quiet. Maybe we hoped one day we'd get the chance. But it never came. Now your daughter. She's making that chance herself. Natalie carefully took the plans in her hands. Her eyes didn't tear up. There was no sadness in them, only resolve. Then we're going to enter these documents into the system, she said. And this time, no one will erase the signatures. The next morning, Natalie and Elijah returned to court, this time not just to respond to charges. This time, they were launching a counterattack. Documents that had never entered the archives, forgotten witnesses, and buried designs were all added to the case file. Judge Dalton was forced to postpone the hearing. The newly submitted evidence didn't just touch on Elijah Moore's innocence, it unearthed the city's long record of systemic erasure. This wasn't just a case about one man anymore. This was a trial of memory itself. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Bell typed a single headline into his phone. This isn't a trial. It's a memory being rebuilt. But the story wasn't over. The shadows following Natalie were growing deeper. There were those who wanted the documents gone. People willing to destroy old plans to keep them buried. And one more witness someone silenced alongside Elijah Moore years ago still hadn't been called to the stand. And that witness was closer than anyone imagined. As the court date approached, the air had shifted. This time, the wind wasn't just blowing outside the courthouse. It was rustling inside the system itself. When Natalie walked into the archive office, she noticed it immediately. Files had been rearranged. Access codes had been updated. But most importantly, the digital folder containing documents from Elijah Moore's past projects had been completely deleted. The screen showed only one message: access denied. Record does not exist. But Natalie had expected this. That's why she had backed up the original scanned copies across multiple independent systems. One backup drive had been entrusted to Charlie, another to Marcus Bell. Just then, Natalie's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Someone on the same train as you still remembers. But time is running out. Only 2 initials followed. JD. Natalie's eyes widened. Elijah's assistant from the 1980s, Jerome Davis. They had worked together on a city center project, and then his name had vanished, wiped from records. But in Elijah's memory, he was still vivid. When Natalie showed him the message, Elijah gave a slow nod. If he's still alive, he's the only one who knows what happened that day. Natalie asked, what happened that day? Elijah looked away. He didn't just draw the plans. That day, he witnessed a senior commission member offer a bribe to shut the project down. And he was silenced. Jerome Davis had stayed silent for years. But Natalie's case had awakened something lodged in his throat, a voice long buried by time and fear. That night, Marcus Bell, Natalie, and Elijah met Jerome in a hidden storage room. He had aged. His eyes darted with fear, even in the dark. But when he began to speak, his voice was clear. I was there. Elijah stood up to them. He turned down the bribe. He refused to let them tear that building down because it was the heart of the community. But some people's profits depended on erasing that memory. Natalie turned on the recorder. Jerome kept talking. Dates, names, codes they poured out one by one. What they had now wasn't just emotional, it was legally explosive. A first-hand confession. But the system had awakened, and it knew how to defend itself. The next morning, Natalie found the window of her car shattered. Nothing was stolen. But there, placed in the glove compartment, was an old newspaper clipping. It was about an accident at a construction site Elijah had worked on years ago. On the edge of the page, written in thick black marker, were the words, "Dig up the past, and it'll bury you." This was no longer just a threat, it was a warning. Still, Natalie didn't back down. She filed a request at the courthouse to place Jerome Davis into the witness protection program. But the system stayed silent. Because this threat didn't come from outside. It came from within, and no one wanted to hear the truth. On the day of the hearing, Elijah, Natalie, and Jerome stood outside the courthouse steps. A crowd was waiting. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a resistance of memory. Elijah straightened his jacket, removed his hat, and looked into Natalie's eyes. This time, I won't stay silent, he said. This isn't just my fight anymore. At that moment, Marcus Bell turned toward his camera and began the live stream. Today, it's not just a man on trial, it's a generation. And for the first time, they won't be silenced. When the doors opened, the courtroom was packed. Judge Dalton looked tense. Natalie closed her eyes, took a deep breath. Elijah gave Jerome a nod, and the testimony began. Inside the courtroom, no one dared to breathe. It wasn't the digital files or the official signatures that shook everyone that day, it was one single voice. Jerome Davis sat at the witness stand, his hands clenched tightly together. But for the first time in decades, his voice was clear. In 1987, Elijah Moore was just seen as a field architect by the city council. But the truth is he was the cornerstone of that building. That day, they offered him a bribe. New plans would be approved, the old building torn down, and a new company would take the lion's share. Elijah refused. I was there. I saw it happen in the council chamber. And then I was silenced. My file was shut down. I was sent out of the city. I haven't seen my name in a single registry since that day. Judge Dalton shifted in his seat. This time, his expression wasn't dismissive, it was fearful. Marcus Bell held his camera steady, live streaming everything. By now, hundreds of thousands were watching. But in the courtroom itself, no one spoke. Because all eyes were fixed on one man, Elijah Moore. Elijah stood. He didn't ask for a microphone. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom. He carried no files, no folders, just memory. I didn't build this city brick by brick, but I left space for people to breathe. I sketched corners where grief could sit, paths where children could run. And one day, maybe someone would tell their grandchild they once walked this very sidewalk. I never stamped my name into the concrete because this wasn't about fame. It was about belonging. The room was so still, you could hear the soft movement of Elijah's coat. Then Natalie stood. For the last time, she walked to her father's side. She opened the leather folder. Inside were the suppressed plans Elijah had drawn, the prototypes he created before the council erased them, and sworn statements documenting Jerome's testimony. She handed them to the judge. Your Honor, with these documents, you're not just judging a man. You're judging an era. This file will be added to the city archive. And this time, nothing will be erased. Dalton remained silent for a long time. Then he looked at the gavel. Slowly, he raised his hand. And as it came down, the sound it made wasn't the sound of a ruling, it was the sound of surrender. The case is dismissed. All property rights are to be restored. Witness statements are to be archived. Elijah Moore's name is to be added to the city's honor roll. There was no applause in the courtroom, because this wasn't a victory. It was a remembering. Once again, silence had won. But this time, silence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a vow. After the hearing, Natalie didn't speak to the press. Neither did Elijah. They simply walked together. A light rain had started to fall. With every step they took, it felt as if the stones beneath them were reclaiming lost memories. Marcus Bell took a photo of the moment and captioned it. Justice doesn't always come on time. But when it does, it brings more than a verdict. It brings memory back. 1 week later, Elijah Moore sat in front of the small house he had built with his wife so many years ago. It wasn't exactly like it used to be, but now, it was officially his. His grandson rode his bike up and down the sidewalk. Natalie was planting new flowers on the porch. Elijah looked out toward the horizon. His eyes weren't teary. They were calm. Because this time, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He had simply come home.